When Cardinal Robert Prevost, soon to become Pope Leo XIV, approached the marble reception desk of Rome's most prestigious hotel, expecting a quiet retreat, he had no idea that a simple room mix-up would expose the heart of a broken man and change both their lives forever. The Palazzo Grandeur's lobby gleamed with polished travertine and crystal chandeliers, its opulent grandeur a stark contrast to the humble black cassock of the elderly cardinal who approached the reception desk with a worn leather travel bag. Cardinal Prevost had specifically requested discretion for this trip. No security detail, no fanfare, just a quiet room where he could prepare for the momentous Vatican meetings ahead. "Good evening," he said gently to the young woman behind the mahogany desk. "I have a reservation under Prevost." The receptionist's fingers danced across her keyboard, her professional smile wavering slightly. "I'm terribly sorry, sir, but there seems to be some confusion. That suite has already been occupied." "Excuse me?" A sharp voice cut through the lobby's refined atmosphere. Marcus Sterling strode across the marble floor, his Italian leather shoes clicking with authority. At 45, Sterling commanded the Palazzo Grandeur with the precision of a military operation and the warmth of a corporate merger. His tailored charcoal suit and steel-grey eyes reflected a man who had built his reputation on perfection and had little patience for anything less. "What's the issue here, Sophia?" Sterling's tone carried the weight of someone accustomed to immediate solutions. "Mr. Sterling, this gentleman has a reservation for the papal suite, but the system shows it's currently occupied by the Morrison party." Sterling's gaze swept over the cardinal dismissively, taking in the simple cassock, the modest travel bag, the worn black shoes that had clearly seen better days. "I see. And you are Cardinal Prevost. I made this reservation through the Vatican's travel office 3 weeks ago." A thin smile played at Sterling's lips. "The Vatican." He drew out the words as if tasting something unpleasant. "Well, Cardinal, I'm afraid there's been some sort of misunderstanding. The papal suite is reserved for our most distinguished guests, heads of state, Fortune 500 executives, actual dignitaries." The cardinal's weathered hands remained folded calmly, but something flickered in his kind eyes. Not anger, but a patient sadness that seemed to recognize the pain beneath Sterling's professional contempt. "Perhaps there's another room available?" Cardinal Prevost asked quietly. Sterling's expression hardened. "Perhaps there's been a mistake about who exactly deserves our premium accommodations." The lobby's evening tranquility shattered as Sterling's voice carried across the marble expanse. Several guests paused their conversations, crystal glasses suspended mid-sip as they turned toward the reception desk. A well-dressed couple near the concierge exchanged glances, while a businessman in the seating area lowered his newspaper to observe the unfolding scene. "Sophia, pull up the reservation details," Sterling commanded, his voice deliberately loud enough to ensure their growing audience could hear every word. "I want to see exactly what we're dealing with here." The young receptionist's fingers trembled slightly as she navigated the computer system. "Sir, the reservation shows Cardinal Prevost, confirmed through Vatican travel services. Payment method." "Payment method," Sterling interrupted, his eyebrows arching with theatrical skepticism. "And how exactly does someone in your profession afford our papal suite? €4,000 per night isn't exactly pocket change for someone who's taken a vow of poverty." Cardinal Prevost's calm demeanor never wavered, though his knuckles whitened slightly as his grip tightened on his travel bag. "The Vatican handles all official travel arrangements. I can assure you—" "The Vatican," Sterling scoffed, turning to address their audience as much as the cardinal. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have someone here claiming to represent one of the world's wealthiest organizations while dressed like he raided a costume shop." A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the gathered crowd. An elderly woman near the elevator shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, perhaps this could be handled more privately." Sterling's steel-grey eyes flashed. "Madam, when someone attempts to defraud my establishment, transparency is exactly what's needed." He turned back to Cardinal Prevost, his voice dripping with professional condescension. "You see, Father, or whoever you are, we've had our share of con artists. Men who dress up in religious garb, thinking it entitles them to special treatment. Playing on people's misguided sympathy, Mr. Sterling," Sophia whispered urgently. "His credentials appear legitimate in the system. Systems can be hacked, databases manipulated." Sterling cut her off. "What I see is an elderly man in a theatrical costume, expecting our most expensive suite without proper identification, without a legitimate credit card, relying solely on some supposed institutional backing." His voice grew colder with each word. "The Catholic Church has perfected the art of taking advantage of others' generosity for centuries. Why should my hotel be any different?" The Cardinal's weathered face remained composed, but something deeper flickered in his eyes. Not hurt at the personal attack, but a profound sadness at witnessing such bitter anger masquerading as professional. "Duty. I understand your concerns," Cardinal Prevost said quietly, his voice barely audible above Sterling's aggressive tone. "Perhaps we could verify the reservation through other means?" Sterling's smile was razor-sharp. "Oh, we're going to verify everything, Cardinal, starting with exactly who you really are." "Let's continue this discussion somewhere more appropriate," Sterling announced, gesturing toward his glass-walled office, overlooking the lobby. Through the transparent barriers, curious guests could still observe the unfolding drama while remaining safely distant from its emotional fallout. Elena Rossi, the assistant manager, hurried after them, her heels clicking nervously against the polished floor. At 32, she had worked under Sterling for 3 years and recognized the dangerous edge creeping into his voice, the same tone that preceded his most devastating professional destructions. Sterling settled behind his mahogany desk like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict, while Cardinal Prevost took the chair across from him with the quiet dignity of a man accustomed to facing far greater storms. Elena positioned herself near the door, clearly uncomfortable with the direction this encounter was taking. "Now then," Sterling began, his fingers steepled before him, "let's discuss your organization's interesting approach to hospitality." His voice carried the clinical precision of a surgeon making the first incision. "The Catholic Church owns billions in real estate, priceless art collections, and investment portfolios that would make Wall Street executives weep with envy. Yet here you sit, playing the humble servant routine." Cardinal Prevost's weathered hands remained folded in his lap. "The Church's resources serve many purposes." "Oh, I'm sure they do," Sterling interrupted, his smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Golden chalices while children starve. Vatican museums filled with treasures while the faithful struggle to pay rent. Tell me, Cardinal, how do you reconcile living in palaces while preaching about poverty?" Elena shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Sterling, perhaps we should focus on resolving the reservation issue." "The reservation issue." Sterling's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than his earlier volume. "Is the least of our concerns here. What we have is a representative of the world's most successful guilt-based corporation expecting special treatment." His steel-grey eyes never left Cardinal Prevost's face. "Your entire existence is built on selling false hope to desperate people, promising rewards in some imaginary afterlife in exchange for their hard-earned money in this very real present." The Cardinal absorbed each word like a stone accepting waves, his expression never changing from one of patient attention. This composure seemed to fuel Sterling's anger rather than diminish it. No response, no righteous indignation. Sterling leaned forward, his voice becoming more personal, more cutting. "Or perhaps you're too busy calculating how much profit you can extract from tonight's performance. After all, martyrdom has always been excellent for business." Through the glass walls, several lobby guests had stopped pretending not to watch, their faces reflecting a mixture of fascination and horror. At Sterling's increasingly vicious display, Cardinal Prevost finally spoke, his voice gentle but unwavering. "You carry deep pain, Mr. Sterling. What happened to cause such anger toward faith?" The question hit its mark with surgical precision. Sterling's professional mask slipped for just an instant, revealing something raw and wounded beneath. Sterling's recovery was swift, but incomplete. The mask of professional authority snapped back into place, though hairline cracks remained visible to those watching closely. And by now, nearly everyone in the Palazzo Grandier's lobby was watching. "Don't psychoanalyze me," Sterling said, rising abruptly from his chair. His movement was sharp enough to cause Elena to step back instinctively. "This has nothing to do with personal feelings and everything to do with institutional hypocrisy." Through the glass walls, the scene had become the evening's primary entertainment. The well-dressed couple from earlier had moved closer, champagne flutes forgotten in their hands. A group of businessmen near the bar had abandoned their conversation entirely, their faces reflecting growing discomfort with Sterling's increasingly aggressive behavior. Even the hotel staff, normally trained to remain invisible, had found reasons to linger within earshot. Sterling seemed oblivious to his audience, or perhaps energized by it. "You want to know what I see when I look at your organization." His voice carried clearly through the glass, reaching every corner of the lobby. "I see the world's oldest protection racket. Pay us and we'll protect your soul. Don't pay us and face eternal damnation." An elderly woman near the concierge desk whispered something sharp to her companion, her disapproval evident even from a distance. A teenage boy traveling with his parents pointed at the office, prompting his mother to quickly pull his hand down while shooting Sterling a look of disgust. "Mr. Sterling," Eleanor tried again, her voice strained. Perhaps we should what, Elena? Pretend that this man represents something noble?" Sterling gestured dramatically toward Cardinal Prevost, who had remained seated throughout the tirade, his hands still folded peacefully in his lap. "Your kind has been exploiting human suffering for 2 millennia, building wealth on the backs of people too desperate or too ignorant to see through the con." A businessman at the bar set down his glass with enough force to create an audible clink. 2 women by the elevator shook their heads in synchronized disapproval. The crowd's mood was shifting, their initial curiosity transforming into collective judgment, not of the cardinal but of the man attacking him. Sterling's voice rose higher, his professional composure completely abandoned now. "Tell me, Cardinal, how many children could have been fed with the money spent on your last golden cathedral renovation? How many homeless could have been housed with the cost of a single papal ceremony?" The cardinal's response came quietly, barely audible through the glass. "You speak as if you've been personally hurt by the church. What happened to you, my son?" The lobby fell silent. Even the ambient sounds of the hotel seemed to pause, waiting for Sterling's answer. His face had gone pale, his hands trembling slightly as the question hung in the air like a challenge he wasn't prepared to meet. The cardinal's gentle question shattered whatever restraint Sterling had been clinging to. His face contorted with a rage so pure and venomous that Elena instinctively moved toward the door, her hand hovering over the handle as if preparing to flee. "What happened to me?" Sterling's voice dropped to a whisper that carried more menace than any shout. "What happened was, I learned the truth about your precious institution." He began pacing behind his desk like a caged predator, his movements sharp and erratic. "I learned about priests who prey on children while bishops cover it up. I learned about Vatican banks laundering money for criminals. I learned about popes living in golden palaces while claiming to serve the poor." For the first time since entering the office, Cardinal Prevost's composure showed hairline fractures. His weathered hands tightened almost imperceptibly in his lap, and something flickered across his face. Not anger, but a deep, weary pain at hearing such accusations leveled with such personal venom. "The Church acknowledges its failures," the Cardinal began quietly. "Acknowledges?" Sterling laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth or humor. "You acknowledge failures the way corporations acknowledge data breaches. Only after you're caught, only to protect your image." He leaned across the desk, his face inches from the Cardinal's. "How many children's lives were destroyed while your organization protected predators? How many families torn apart while you worried about your reputation?" Elena's face had gone ashen. "Mr. Sterling, please..." "Please what, Elena? Please pretend that this man doesn't represent an institution built on lies and suffering." Sterling's voice cracked with something beyond professional anger, something personal and devastating. "Please ignore the fact that they've been selling salvation to desperate people for centuries while living like kings." The Cardinal's eyes filled with genuine sorrow, not for himself, but for the broken man before him. "The pain you carry..." "Don't you dare!" Sterling snarled, slamming his palm against the desk with enough force to make Elena jump. "Don't you dare try to counsel me. Your kind destroyed any faith I might have had. Your institution took everything, pure and innocent, and twisted it into something ugly and corrupt." Through the glass walls, the lobby audience had grown larger, their faces reflecting horror at Sterling's complete emotional breakdown. Several guests had pulled out phones, though whether to record the scene or call for help was unclear. "You want to know what your church taught me?" Sterling's voice was raw now, stripped of all professional pretense. "It taught me that hope is a lie, that trust is weakness, and that anyone who claims to serve God is really just serving themselves." The Cardinal sat in silence, absorbing the assault with the patience of a man who had witnessed far worse storms, his presence somehow becoming more solid and compassionate as Sterling's attacks grew more vicious. "You have nothing to say?" Sterling demanded, his breath coming in short gasps. "No platitudes about forgiveness, no promises of redemption?" Cardinal Prevost looked up with eyes that held no judgment, only infinite sadness for the wounded soul before him. Sterling's pacing had become frantic, his expensive suit wrinkled from the tension coiled in his shoulders. Each step seemed to wind him tighter, like a spring approaching its breaking point. The Cardinal remained motionless in his chair, a pillar of calm in the storm of Sterling's rage. "You sit there so peacefully," Sterling said, his voice cracking with exhaustion and fury. "So serene, so holy. Do you know what that reminds me of?" He stopped pacing abruptly, his hands pressed flat against the glass wall overlooking the lobby. "It reminds me of Sister Catherine. She had that same expression when she told my family that God had a plan." The Cardinal's head tilted slightly, sensing the shift towards something deeper and more personal. "God had a plan," Sterling repeated, his breath fogging the glass. "That's what she said when my 8-year-old sister was dying of leukemia. That's what she said when my parents spent every penny they had on treatments. That's what she said when we lost our house because the medical bills destroyed us." His voice began to shake. God had a plan. Elena had gone completely still, her hand still on the door handle, afraid to move or speak. "And where was your merciful God when my sister cried for her mother in that hospital room?" Sterling's forehead touched the glass now, his entire frame trembling. "Where was he when my parents' marriage fell apart from the stress? Where was his plan when my father started drinking and my mother stopped getting out of bed?" The Cardinal's weathered face showed profound compassion, but he remained silent, understanding that Sterling needed to purge the poison he'd been carrying. 43 years I've been waiting for someone to explain God's plan to me," Sterling whispered, his breath creating small clouds on the glass. 43 years of watching your institution collect money from desperate families while children suffer and die." The office door burst open without warning. Victoria Ashford, the hotel's owner, strode in with the authority of someone accustomed to solving crises. At 58, she commanded respect through presence rather than volume. Her silver hair and elegant bearing radiating a confidence that immediately changed the room's energy. "Marcus," she said simply, her voice carrying decades of friendship and concern. "What's happening here?" Sterling straightened, attempting to reassemble his professional mask, but the damage was too extensive. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face streaked with perspiration, his entire being laid bare by the emotional hemorrhaging of the past hour. "Victoria," he managed, his voice hoarse, "I was handling a reservation dispute." "This doesn't look like a reservation dispute," Victoria said quietly, her gaze moving between Sterling's shattered composure and the Cardinal's patient dignity. "This looks like a man in pain." Sterling's laugh was bitter and broken. "Pain? No, Victoria. This is clarity." But even as he spoke the words, his hands continued to shake, betraying the truth his voice tried to deny. "Let's continue this conversation somewhere private," Victoria said, her tone leaving no room for argument. She gestured toward the elevator. "The Medici suite is empty." The journey to the top floor passed in weighted silence. Sterling stared at the elevator's brass buttons, while Cardinal Prevost observed him with the quiet attention of someone who had witnessed countless human breakdowns. Victoria's presence seemed to create a buffer zone of calm professionalism that allowed Sterling to begin reassembling himself, though his hands still trembled slightly. The Medici suite overlooked the Roman skyline, its floor-to-ceiling windows, framing the eternal city in golden evening light. Victoria poured 3 glasses of water from a crystal pitcher, her movements deliberate and soothing. Sterling collapsed into a leather armchair as if his strings had been cut, while the Cardinal chose a simple wooden chair near the window. 43 years, Sterling began without preamble, his voice hollow. "That's how long I've been angry at God." He looked directly at Cardinal Prevost for the first time since his breakdown. "My sister Emma was the brightest, most joyful child you've ever seen. 8 years old and already reading at a high school level. She wanted to be a doctor, said she was going to cure everything." Victoria settled into her chair, her expression carefully neutral, giving Sterling space to unburden himself. "The diagnosis came on a Tuesday," Sterling continued, his voice gaining strength from finally speaking these words aloud. "Acute lymphoblastic leukemia, stage 4. The doctors gave her 6 months." His laugh was bitter. "Your church gave her prayer cards." Cardinal Prevost's weathered hands folded in his lap, his attention completely focused on Sterling's pain. "We sold everything," Sterling whispered. "The house, my mother's jewelry, my father's tools. We drove to every treatment center, every experimental program, every miracle doctor we could find. And at every hospital there were chaplains, priests, nuns, all of them telling us the same thing: have faith, trust in God's plan, pray harder." The room had grown quiet except for the distant sounds of Rome's evening traffic. "She lasted 14 months, Sterling said, his voice breaking. 14 months of watching her beautiful spirit get crushed by pain and fear. And through it, all the religious people kept telling us it was part of some divine purpose, that her suffering meant something, that God needed another angel." Sterling's composure finally shattered completely. What kind of God needs to torture a child to get an angel? What kind of plan requires destroying an innocent family? The words came out as a broken whisper. And what kind of people defend such cruelty? Cardinal Prevost leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle but steady. "I cannot defend suffering, Marcus. I can only sit with it." For the first time in decades, Sterling didn't have a response. He simply sat there, broken and empty, finally hearing his own pain echoed back with compassion. Instead of platitudes, the weight of Sterling's confession hung in the air like incense, heavy and transformative. Cardinal Prevost had listened without interruption, his presence somehow absorbing Sterling's pain without judgment or deflection. Victoria watched both men with the careful attention of someone trying to piece together a puzzle whose complete picture remained hidden. "Marcus," she said gently, "I've known you for 8 years, and you've never spoken about your sister." Sterling wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, embarrassed by his emotional display. "What's the point? She's gone. God's plan, remember?" The words carried less venom now, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. Victoria's phone buzzed softly. She glanced at the screen, and her expression shifted from concern to something approaching alarm. "Excuse me," she said, rising quickly. "I need to make a call." She stepped into the suite's adjoining room, but her voice carried clearly through the thin walls as she spoke in rapid Italian. Sterling caught fragments. Vatican, Cardinal, immediately. Cardinal Prevost seemed unsurprised by Victoria's sudden departure, his calm demeanor unchanged. Sterling, however, felt a cold dread beginning to settle in his chest. Victoria returned. Moments later, her face pale and her professional composure strained. She looked directly at Cardinal Prevost with something that resembled awe. "Your Eminence," she said formally, "I've just spoken with my contact at the Vatican. They've been trying to reach you for hours." Sterling's confusion was evident. "Victoria." "What, Marcus?" she interrupted, her voice tight with controlled panic. "Do you know who you've been speaking with this evening?" The Cardinal raised a gentle hand. "Victoria, please." "Cardinal Robert Prevost," she continued, ignoring his attempt to deflect, "is not just any Vatican official. He's the prefect of the dicastery for bishops, one of the most senior cardinals in the Catholic Church." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "He's considered by many to be the leading candidate to become the next pope." Sterling's face went from confusion to horror to absolute mortification in the span of seconds. The color drained from his features as the full magnitude of his behavior crashed over him like a wave. "No," he whispered, "no, that's not. You would have said, 'I travel without fanfare when possible,'" Cardinal Prevost said simply. "I find people are more honest when they don't know who they're speaking with." Sterling buried his face in his hands. "Dear God," he moaned, "what have I done? I attacked, I accused, I said things." His voice became muffled by his palms. "My career is over. My reputation is destroyed. Everything I've worked for." But when he looked up, expecting to see judgment or satisfaction in the Cardinal's eyes, he found only the same patient compassion that had been there throughout his. "Tirad." "Marcus," Cardinal Prevost said quietly, "what you've shown me tonight isn't your worst self. It's your most honest self. And honesty, even painful honesty, is where healing begins." Sterling stared at him in disbelief, unable to comprehend such grace in the face of such disrespect. The silence stretched between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Cardinal Prevost studied Sterling's face with an intensity that seemed to be searching for something specific, a recognition that flickered just beyond reach. "Marcus Sterling," the Cardinal said slowly, as if testing the name on his tongue. "Tell me, was your family from Detroit? Your father worked at the Ford plant?" Sterling looked up sharply, confusion cutting through his shame. How could you possibly know that? The Cardinal's weathered features softened with something that looked like wonder, mixed with profound sadness. "And your sister Emma, she had curly red hair and freckles across her nose. She loved to draw pictures of angels with enormous wings." Sterling's breath caught in his throat. "You couldn't know that. No one remembers those details except—" He trailed off, his mind struggling to process what was happening. "Except the people who knew her," Cardinal Prevost finished gently. "Marcus, I spent considerable time at Children's Hospital of Michigan in the early 1980s. I was a young priest, and then barely 30, assigned to the pediatric ward as a chaplain." Victoria had grown completely still, sensing that something profound was unfolding before her. "There was a little girl," the Cardinal continued, his voice thick with memory, "who Used to show me her drawings every Tuesday when I made my rounds. She had the most infectious laugh, and she was determined to draw an angel big enough to carry all the sick children to heaven where they wouldn't hurt any more. Sterling's hands began to shake. Emma showed those drawings to everyone. The nurses, the doctors. His voice cracked. The young priest who always sat with families in the waiting room. She worried about you, Cardinal Prevost said softly. Her big brother who worked 2 jobs and slept in the hospital chair. She made me promise to pray especially hard for you, because you carried everyone's pain and never cried where anyone could see. The words hit Sterling like a physical blow. He doubled over in his chair, decades of carefully constructed walls crumbling in an instant. You were there, he whispered. You were there when she... I held her hand, the Cardinal confirmed, tears now flowing freely down his own cheeks, and yours, and your parents'. In the final moments, when the machines stopped, you all held each other, and I prayed with you. Do you remember? Sterling's memory came flooding back, the young priest with kind eyes, who had somehow made the unbearable moment feel less lonely, who had stayed with them through the night, who had helped them find words when there were no words. Father Robert. Sterling breathed, the name emerging from a place of buried grief. You said she would always be with us. That love doesn't end. I still believe that, Cardinal Prevost said simply. And Marcus, she would be so proud of the man you've become. Even in your anger, even in your pain, you've spent your life ensuring that others have comfort and beauty and dignity. That's her legacy living through you. Sterling began to sob, deep, wrenching sounds that seemed to come from his very core. 43 years of grief and rage, finally finding their release. Victoria quietly left the room, understanding that she was witnessing something sacred and private. She's still with you, the Cardinal whispered, reaching across to touch Sterling's shoulder. She always has been. An hour later, Cardinal Prevost led Sterling through the hotel's quiet corridors to a small chapel tucked away on the 2nd floor, a space most guests never discovered, designed for moments when the soul needed. Sanctuary more than luxury. Votive candles cast dancing shadows across simple wooden pews, and a modest altar held a single crucifix that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the flickering light. Sterling had stopped crying, but his face bore the raw vulnerability of someone who had been emotionally flayed open. He moved like a man walking through a dream, following the Cardinal not out of religious conviction, but from a desperate need to understand what was happening to him. I haven't been in a chapel since her funeral, Sterling whispered, his voice echoing softly in the intimate space. I swore I'd never set foot in another church again. Cardinal Prevost settled into a pew near the back, his presence somehow making the small space feel safer rather than smaller. What did you swear that day, Marcus? What promises did you make to yourself? Sterling remained standing, his hands clenched at his sides. I swore I'd never trust anyone who claimed to speak for God. I swore I'd never believe in miracles or prayer, or any of it. His voice grew stronger, more certain. I swore I'd build a life based on what I could control, what I could measure, what I could guarantee. And did that bring you peace? The question hung in the air like incense. Sterling finally sank into the pew across the aisle from the Cardinal, his expensive suit incongruous against the humble wooden bench. For a while, he admitted, success was my religion, money was my salvation, control was my God. He laughed, bitterly. I built hotels where everything was perfect, where every detail was managed, where no one ever had to face the kind of chaos that destroyed my family. But tonight you lost control, Cardinal Prevost observed gently. Tonight I lost everything, Sterling corrected. My professional reputation, my carefully maintained image, my armor. He looked around the chapel as if seeing it for the first time. 43 years of holding it together, and 5 minutes with you and I fell apart completely. The Cardinal leaned forward slightly. Marcus, What if falling apart isn't the end of your story? What if it's the beginning? Sterling's laugh was hollow. Beginning of what? I can't undo what I said, what I did. I can't take back decades of anger and bitterness. No, the Cardinal agreed, but you can choose what comes next. The simple statement seemed to unlock something in Sterling. His shoulders began to shake, not with rage this time, but with something deeper, a grief so profound it seemed to encompass not just his sister's death, but every moment of joy he'd denied himself since. "I miss her so much," he whispered, the words torn from his throat. "I miss believing that someone was watching over us. I miss thinking that love was stronger than death. I miss having hope." Cardinal Prevost's voice was barely audible in the sacred silence. "Hope isn't something you lose, Marcus. It's something you choose to pick up again." They returned to the Medici suite in contemplative silence, the chapel's peace still clinging to them like morning mist. Sterling felt hollowed out, but strangely lighter, as if years of accumulated rage had finally found an exit wound. Cardinal Prevost moved with the quiet dignity of a man who had witnessed countless transformations, understanding that healing happened in its own time and rhythm. Victoria was waiting for them, her face tense with barely contained urgency. "Your Eminence," she said the moment they entered, "I've received several urgent calls from the Vatican. They need to speak with you immediately." The Cardinal nodded calmly, though Sterling noticed a subtle shift in his posture, a straightening that suggested he was preparing for significant news. "Thank you, Victoria. Perhaps I should—" His phone rang before he could finish the sentence. The ring-tone was simple, unremarkable, but something in the Cardinal's expression suggested this call would be anything but ordinary. "Cardinal Prevost," he answered, his voice maintaining its characteristic gentleness despite the formal tone. Sterling couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but he watched the Cardinal's face transform. First came surprise, then a deep solemnity, and finally something that looked like acceptance of an enormous burden. "I understand," the Cardinal said quietly. "Yes, I accept." A pause. "May God give me wisdom for what lies ahead," he ended a call and stood motionless for a long moment, the phone still in his hand. When he looked up, his eyes held a weight that hadn't been there moments before. "Your Eminence," Victoria asked softly. "The College of Cardinals has made their decision," he said simply. "I have been elected to serve as Pope Leo XIV. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Victoria gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. Sterling felt the blood drain from his face as the full magnitude of what had transpired crashed over him with devastating clarity. "No," Sterling whispered, his voice barely audible. "No, this can't be happening." The man he had attacked, insulted, and humiliated for hours, the man he had accused of fraud and hypocrisy, was now the leader of 1.3 billion Catholics worldwide. The man whose faith he had mocked and whose integrity he had questioned had just been chosen to guide the universal church. "I called you a fraud," Sterling said, his voice rising with horror. "I questioned your right to be here. I accused your Church of—" He couldn't finish the sentence, the weight of his actions crushing down on him. Cardinal Prevost, now Pope Leo XIV, looked at Sterling with the same compassion he had shown throughout their entire encounter. "Marcus," he said gently, "what you shared with me tonight was honest. Your pain was real. Your anger was justified. Nothing about my new role changes that." Sterling sank into a chair, overwhelmed. "I insulted the Pope. I insulted the Pope before. He was even the Pope. You spoke with a man who needed to hear your truth," came the quiet response. "And perhaps that man needed to understand the depth of suffering that exists before he could properly serve." Within an hour, word of Pope Leo XIV's presence at the Palazzo Grandeur had spread through Rome's media networks. television crews assembled outside with remarkable speed, their satellite trucks lining the cobblestone streets as reporters prepared for what would become one of the most significant papal announcements in recent memory. Inside the lobby, the atmosphere had transformed completely. The same guests who had witnessed Sterling's verbal assault now stood in hushed reverence, many crossing themselves as they realized they had been present for a moment of profound historical significance. Sterling stood near the reception desk, where it had all begun, his expensive suit wrinkled and his face bearing the evidence of emotional exhaustion. He had insisted on making a public apology, despite Pope Leo XIV's gentle attempts to dissuade him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria announced, "His Holiness, Pope Leo XIV, will address you briefly before departing for the Vatican." Pope Leo XIV emerged from the elevator with the same quiet dignity he had maintained throughout the evening, though something in his bearing had shifted. The mantle of papal authority rested on his shoulders now, visible in the way others instinctively stepped, back to create a respectful space around him. "Your Holiness," Sterling called out, his voice cutting through the reverential silence, "I need to apologize publicly for what I said to you tonight. I was cruel to a man who showed me nothing but kindness. I attacked someone who responded to my anger with grace." The lobby fell into complete silence. Camera crews outside pressed against the windows, sensing something significant unfolding within. Pope Leo XIV stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "Marcus," he said softly, though his words carried clearly, "there is nothing to forgive. Your pain was real. Your questions were honest. Sometimes we must walk through the darkness to find our way back to the light. But I said terrible things. About the church, about faith, about you personally," Sterling insisted. "And in doing so, you reminded me why my role exists," the Pope replied with gentle firmness. "Not to defend an institution from criticism, but to serve those who are hurting. Your sister Emma would be proud of your honesty tonight." Sterling's composure crumbled at the mention of his sister's name. "I don't know how to find my way back to faith." "Faith isn't a destination, Marcus. It's a conversation. And conversations can begin anywhere, anytime." Pope Leo XIV's voice carried profound wisdom. "Perhaps you could help me with something. The Vatican has need of people who understand hospitality, who create spaces where the broken can find beauty and dignity. Would you consider lending your expertise to our efforts?" The offer hung in the air like an impossible gift. Sterling stared at the Pope in disbelief. "You would trust me with that? After tonight?" "Especially after tonight," Pope Leo XIV replied, with a gentle smile. "Who better to create sanctuary than someone who has wandered in the wilderness?" As news crews captured the moment, Sterling knelt spontaneously, not in religious submission, but in recognition of grace beyond his comprehension. The Pope helped him to his feet, and in that gesture, 43 years of anger began its transformation into something resembling hope. 6 months later, when Sterling established the Emma Foundation, providing hospitality and comfort to families facing medical crises, a small framed drawing hung in his office. An angel with enormous wings, sketched by a little girl who had believed that love could carry anyone home.